Well, one of the things that occasionally gets me in trouble is teasing my wife. I'm not exactly sure my wife teases me as much as I tease her. Well, actually, I tease her a whole lot more. Maybe it's from learning that as an older brother, but one of the things, ways that I tease my wife is I'll occasionally ask her, "Are you living your best life?" She hates that phrase, "living your best life." And so that's something I'll ask her that drives her nuts. But I want to do a podcast today and talk about my best life as a pastor. And I guess this comes out of, looking back at 30 years of active pastoring, through the good seasons and the bad seasons. Seasons that some seasons were stronger than others, but you may ask, well, this is a recovery podcast, Vern. Why are we doing a general podcast around pastoral ministry? But, I am really aware that, for me anyways, when I was struggling and not doing as well, it's like a lot of those hidden and unmanageable behaviors would seem to surge forward. And when I felt like I was doing better, or stronger, or had more equilibrium in my life, it's like some of those unmanageable or seemingly unmanageable behaviors would recede, and they would not play as big a role in my life. So this is connected. And so I guess for me, that's partly why I do want you're ready to live your best pastoral life. And I guess I've learned some things. Interesting, me and my wife this morning, we seem to have our best talks kind of first thing in the morning. And she was off to school this morning, but we were both up pretty early. And we started having one of those talks about, looking back, when did we do better? When didn't we do better? What were some of those things that got us through those years? And it's not like I'm still not involved in pastoral ministry. I am, just not actively involved with all of the leadership dynamics that I've been. So I want to give you three postures or three things that I think I was doing and living in and walking out when I was doing well. And I think these three things can serve you well and help you through the tough times. And again, these are three things that made a big difference for me. And they also made a big difference in, I guess, having a sense of strength over some of those unmanageable behaviors like porn and other things that would always seek to invite themselves back into my life. So let me give these three to you, and I want to just make a few comments. First one is the area of calling. Now, I never wanted to be a pastor, really. I never was. If you ask me through my growing up years and even my high school years, and even into my early college years, are you going to be a pastor? I would go, who? Me? What? Like, it was just so far out of my realm of thinking. And now I did have, when I was 19, a significant experience at a conference. It was back in my Navigator days. And I still remember the speaker, Skip Gray. And at 19, I went down to a conference in Seattle, and I still remember God really pressing on my life. You did not choose me, Vern, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last. And that promise was always something got lodged in my spirit, in the marrow of my bones. And so I didn't know what it meant at the time. I thought for a while I was going to be a chartered accountant. Nothing wrong with being a chartered accountant. And then I was going to be a high school teacher, which I got the training for. And of course, I still dabble in. But for me, calling has been kind of an unfolding thing. And I know I'm not the only one. I was recently listening to a podcast with Beth Moore, who was talking about the book she just written. And she described her life in kind of a similar way, where she simply said, I just kind of do the next thing that God brings to me. It wasn't this great 20-year plan. And I really resonated with that. And my wife said, it's Vern, you're kind of like an unfolder. You just kind of, whatever the next thing is, you step into and you walk out of one stage and you step into the next stage. And so that's something that has been true of my life. But around calling, I have come to believe that, and I had a couple really significant experiences, and this one came out of a really bad, difficult time in my life when I was approaching my 40s. I call it my perfect storm, and you can go back and listen to that in one of the earlier podcasts. And I really felt strongly that God spoke to me out of the scripture where Peter had already, abandoned Jesus once, but Jesus turns back to Peter and says, "Peter, do you love me?" And of course, good Bible teachers that you are, that he asked him 3 times. And Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? I think one was take care of my lambs. Peter, do you love me? And, what that said to me was this, and it helped me through some really difficult times. I am a pastor out of love for Jesus. My expression of love towards people is only within the subcategory of my love for Jesus. And so, you know what? It really helped me when people would no longer love me, or people would turn away, or people would leave the church. And it would remind me, I am not doing this for anybody. I am not even doing this ultimately for people. My love for people, here's a little pastoral secret, ebbed and flowed. Sometimes I didn't love people a whole lot. Sometimes I would seem to muster up a whole lot of love and compassion. But here's the thing. For me, my love for Jesus was what sustained me. The calling to be a pastor out of love for Jesus. Vern, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. I don't know what you do if you don't have a sense of calling. I think you got to go and really ask yourself. I sometimes said I was a bit of a reluctant pastor. And, I go, ask God what you're supposed to be doing. I've sometimes said to people who were too eager to be a pastor or in ministry, I would say, if you can do anything else, do it. But I really felt called. I really felt in that situation. And when people would no longer recognize my calling or have confidence in my calling or want to be, pastored by me, it would be like, ultimately, I'm not doing it for you. It's not about you. It's about Jesus. And whether I'm a good pastor or a bad pastor, whether I'm successful or unsuccessful, I am doing this, to whatever degree of effectiveness out of my love for Jesus. So calling for me is a pretty central thing that got me through as a posture through some pretty dark times. That's the first one. The second one I would say is just gratefulness. And these last 2 are from my wife. She says a couple other things. She says, number one, she said in her life, gratefulness was a real key to remaining and lasting in this place of ministry. And, it is a privilege to be in ministry. Now, it comes with a lot of side effects and a lot of difficulties, but you think about it, it is a privilege. And whenever I could make alive gratefulness, whenever I came up with a song that would help me with gratefulness, I would play it over and over and over again, reminding myself, I am blessed, I am grateful for so many things in my life. This morning I was out for a walk. I was listening to a song by Ben Rector called Thank You. And I just, because, he goes on in the song and it says, so we can remember so we can remember. Then at the end of the song, he says, so I can remember. And I would have to stir up and remind myself, practice gratefulness, right? Because as soon as I started looking at all of the downsides and negatives, it's just like, why am I doing this? Back to calling, and then stir up gratefulness. I am blessed to be able to do this. I am blessed to be a child of God. I am blessed to be able to serve him in this way. And I'm not saying that my life would have been miserable as a teacher. We sometimes asked ourselves, well, what would our life have looked like if we both taught school? You know, my wife would have taught elementary, I would have taught high school. And I don't know. The bottom line is I'm an unfolder. I sought to obey God. And then the gratefulness was a way that I continued to remind myself, yes, this is the path that God has called me on. And even when things around me were falling apart or not looking very good or going sideways, or you go one step forward and two steps back sometimes, and we were in a two-step back place, still to be grateful for the things God had done. And the third one, I would say, is forgiveness. Learning to practice forgiveness, and you won't get very far in ministry until you learn to make forgiveness a pretty central part of your toolkit. I remember listening to, back when I was just starting out, there was a kind of a pastoral class by a guy who's mentored a lot of pastors. His name is Steve Nicholson, out of Chicago area. And he did these, I think it was on cassettes, called Future Pastors Classes. And I loved it. And one of the things he talked about is, he says, you're going to face many different kind of people in your life as a pastor. And in true pastor style, they all started with the same letter, W. And I can't remember all. I think there was 5, and I can only remember 4. He says, you're going to meet wounded people. You're going to meet weary people. You're going to meet wicked people. Now I can only remember 3 of them. You're going to meet wounded, weary, wicked. Somebody said me the other 2. But his point was, you're going to meet all kinds of people. And in fact, the way you work with people is going to depend on where they're at in their life. Are they just tired? Are they weary? They need to be encouraged and strengthened. Are they wounded? Healing needs to be brought into their lives. Are they wicked? They need to be confronted. Different examples. And again, you can tell I'm missing 2 of them. So, but the point was this, you're going to meet all sorts of people, and you are not going to get the benefit of the doubt by many of them. My favorite Old Testament quote is, I think it's Belshazzar, or maybe it's Nebuchadnezzar. The writing on the wall when he's at his big party, and all of a sudden the hand of God begins to write on the wall. And I think it's Mene, Tekel, Parsons. And it goes, you have been measured on my scales and found wanting. Something along those lines. You can tell this is an off the cuff message, but I do remember Mene, Tekel, Parsons, because I can't tell you how many times as a pastor, people would come and write on my wall, you have been measured in my scales and found wanting. It could be their issues of wounding. It could be that they're just so insecure, their mommy or daddy issues that they were projecting on me, their disappointments with church, their disappointments with God, their frustrations with their own life. It could be 100 things, right? That you would be found wanting in their eyes. And, some of them walk away quietly. Some of them walk away loudly, right? And they let you know that it's your failures as a pastor, the reason. And we just live in that. That's the crucible a pastor lives in. Guys, I get it. Gals, I get it. I understand. And the question becomes, how do you go through ministry without collecting? It's like trying to walk with rubber boots through a muddy field without collecting a whole bunch of of mud in your boots where your feet get heavier and heavier. And, it's easy to get cynical. No good deed goes unpunished. I remember one guy telling me, he says, I swear the people that I have done the most for, the ones that I have made great sacrifices for, the ones that I really went over and above, those are the ones that just feel free to walk away and say, oh, thanks, but no thanks. God's called us somewhere else. Our kids need a better youth group, or, our kids ministry. We need something, or you can tell I'm getting worked up. That's just the reality of this thing we're called into. So you go back to, do you love me? Feed my sheep. As long as they're your sheep, feed them. When they're not, then what do? Practice gratefulness, and then you release them back to God in forgiveness, right? When people fail to respond appropriately, release them back to God in forgiveness. We were talking this morning, me and my wife were talking about forgiveness, and, it's kind of one of those, when you ever heard the phrase, he's smiling, but it's not reaching his eyes. It's kind of a fake smile. Well, forgiveness can feel a little bit like that. I'm trying to forgive, but maybe like the guy that approaches Jesus for healing, and Jesus says, well, anything's possible for someone who believes. And the man in desperation says, I do believe. Help me in my unbelief. And I think most of us would probably say, I do forgive. Help me in my unforgiveness. And so, I guess as I look back and go, I just have to return to some of those square one, base one sorts of things. Am I called to do this? God, thank you for calling me. I'm grateful for being your child. I'm grateful for being used by you. I continually release people back to you in a process of forgiveness. As I do that, I can continue to operate in the lightness of grace. The heaviness, I think I can release the heaviness back to God and operate in the lightness of grace. And when I do that, then other things like porn or whatever those old temptations, whatever those old addictive patterns, it can keep them at bay. Now, do I do this perfectly? No. Do I need other people alongside me to remind me of these things? Absolutely. You know how much we've talked about the value of peer relationships, of walking together with a group of people. And I would just say, if you are a pastor and you don't have 2 or 3 guys that are peers that you can walk with, I'd really start praying consistently and really passionately, God, would you give me 2 or 3 other people that I can walk with in this journey, who understand me. And when I'm starting to get, weighted down, they can come alongside me and they can remind me of my calling, my grateful, they can remind me, they can call me back to gratefulness and forgiveness. I consider one of my one of the fellows that helped me the most when I was going through the worst part of my early 40s was a friend of mine, Graham. And Graham came alongside of me, and he would listen to me, and I would share my struggles and my frustrations, and people love to give you their opinions of you. And at some point, I remember Graham looking at me and going, "Vern, you're a good pastor." Right? And it's like when Jonathan came to David and encouraged him and strengthened him. So I would pray that you find some Jonathans in your life who can be that source of encouragement and strength. I pray that this week you would discover or renew your sense of calling. Gratefulness would well up in your heart, and you would find the grace to begin to forgive. And that's a work of grace. Sometimes, let me just go back to forgiveness for a second. We used to, when I grew up on a farm, we would take hard ground, and the very first thing we would do is we would put a plow in it. The alfalfa fields needed to be reseeded every so many years. So the first thing you do is you would do a plow. A plow would break up the hard ground. Well, that's unforgiveness and bitterness. And the plow would go through and break it up. And then the next thing they would do is you would switch that, and you would use a disc. And then all the different discs would then break those large clumps of dirt up into smaller clumps. And that's the work of forgiveness, where we do it in our own lives, and then we also do that and release that to God regarding other people. So once again, calling, gratefulness, and forgiveness. Would you experience the lightness of God's grace in your life today? God bless.